Hello, just a small disclaimer before I start this podcast. I just want to say that for the sake of continuity and transition time within the podcast, I'm going to explain how essentially the sources I will refer to will be on the visual aid of the presentation. And I will still be referring to them, but just as a small disclaimer, I will be focusing on relaying the information and not necessarily citing the long myriad of sources. I will still refer to them and cite them, but for the sake of integrity and other aspects of the podcast, they will be on the visual aid of the podcast. Hello, today my name is Alexander Kasperuk, and today I'm going to be talking about the role and prominence of nationalism within the nation of Poland during the time of occupation under the Russian Empire, and how this nationalism helped forge the uprisings of 1830 and 1863 to 64. So, thank you, and I will now begin. The nation of Poland, once known as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was a prominent and relatively powerful state ever since the Middle Ages. This nation would have long-standing conflicts with other prominent nation-states such as Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and would even see combat against the Ottoman Empire. Despite Poland's prominence within the history of Central and Eastern Europe, they would see the destruction of their borders 3 times at the hands of Prussia, Russia, and Austria within the years of 1772, 1793, and 1795, only having brief sovereignty under Napoleon's efforts when he invaded Russia, and he would subsequently create the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. But this brief amount of sovereignty allowed the reclamation of Polish lands, but eventually would not cease to keep the sovereignty following the defeat of Napoleon in the Congress of Vienna. The nations of Poland and Lithuania would not retain any sovereignty for a collective amount of 123 years, as, again, nations such as Prussia, Austria, and most notably the Russian Empire, who partitioned much of the land of Poland, would lay claim to this prominent nation. Poland would only be able to resurface as a nation until 1918 amidst the absolute chaos and destruction of World War I. And just for citation's sake, I'm getting this information from the Cambridge Concise History of Poland, starting on page 109. And please refer to the visual aid for the exact citation. But going back to the podcast, the primary question that arises from this information is, how can a country like Poland maintain its culture, language, and religion in the midst of Russian imperial oversight and invasion? And the answer to I'm going to say is ideology. More specifically, Romanticism and nationalism is what allowed for the survival of the Polish nation and what allowed for it to survive until its reformation in 1918. This was done and carried out on 3 fronts, and these 3 fronts I'm going to explain later on in the podcast, these being the Polish nobility, the peasantry of Poland, and the Catholic and Uniate churches' influence. For the sake of this podcast, I'll explain how Polish nationalism played a prominent role in key historical moments of the Polish uprisings of 1830 and 1863. And this will be seen in how Poland's nobility was able to spearhead nationalism into forming actual military uprisings, peasant assistance in both ideology and the military, as well as the melding of nationalism with Polish Catholicism and the Uniate Church. So let's begin. All right. So firstly, I want to give some context to what Polish nobility actually is. So when I refer to Polish nobility, this term is unique in its nature. The nobility of Poland is very different from the traditional nobility of Western Europe, such as the French nobility of Versailles and the lords of Britain. To quote Jerzy Lukowski and his work Disorderly Liberty, the Polish nation were, and I quote from him, distinct and disparate. End quote. And to begin with, the Polish nobility, or how they refer to themselves as the Szlachta, had a much larger population than a standard aristocracy in Western Europe. Each individual city and town had extensive membership of lower class nobles as well as higher class nobility, who would be in charge of running the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth at the time. Um, and this involved running the nation financially, militarily, politically. Um, Interestingly enough, only a select few of these nobles, typically the upper echelon, were literate. There is a significant instance of lower class nobles who weren't literate, but nonetheless were still capable of running the country, and had extensive political control within the region, as well as astonishing military mobilization, hence their Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth's success in the Middle Ages, but this mobilization was not key or helpful during the partitions of Poland. Um, Interestingly enough, Poland was one of the first nations to subscribe to a constitutional monarchy, in which these nobles would vote and create decisions within a bicameral parliament, again, according to Lukowski. Um, and this parliament system was referred to as the Sejm, and smaller parliamentary councils were referred to as the Sejmiki, where lower nobles would partake in the political process, typically not in prominent cities like Krakow or Warsaw. Um, this Sejm would be responsible for electing the kings of Poland, and this constitutional monarchy in parliament had widespread participation and actually arguably did well to represent the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, considering how large the aristocratic population was. Um, the fact of the matter is that it could be argued that Poland's unique style of government, this expansive constitutional monarchy and parliament with a large amount of nobility, it creates a unique national identity for the country tied to this government style. Coupled with the widespread participation, it makes it a promulgated phenomenon in which the decision making of Poland's government is just as widespread as this identity. These nobles were the primary actors and decision makers of the Polish nation, and would subsequently be the primary agents of turning the ideas of upholding national identity, national culture, and language as the ideal. These ideas, again, are the main philosophies of nationalism, uh, and would turn these philosophies into actual attempts to establish this, especially after Poland would lose its sovereignty multiple times, mostly from the Russian Empire. The nobility of Poland would manifest these ideas of nationalism and upholding their nationality into real military uprisings after the identity that is tied immensely with their government structure was at direct risk. So, not giving that context, I will now go into how these nobles actually created military uprisings. Going directly into the nobility during the uprising of 1830 and 1831, um, Poland experienced this brief time of sovereignty under Napoleon, but would subsequently go away after his defeat in 1815. But the Russian Empire would take primary control of Poland at this time, but would still give it relative autonomy that they had under Napoleon. It would maintain the status quo. They still had their same. Technically, they did not have a king that fell to the Russian Empire, but the Russian Tsars never officially crowned themselves the king of Poland. That all changed, however, in 1829, when Tsar Nicholas I, who was an incredibly pro-Russian Tsar, decided to take the reins, and he crowned himself king of Poland, which was something that had not been done since Napoleon's time. And this event, according to Piotr Kulakowski and Viktor Marzec, and their work "Who May Represent a Nation in Upheaval," Poland began an uprising in 1830 against the infringement of their autonomy they had prior to Tsar Nicholas. Arguably, it could be said that this first serious encroachment against the Polish government and its national identity by the foreign invaders of Russia spurred ideas of independence into full swing, as the nobility would join the military and fight in a year-long battle against the large Russian Empire in order to secure their national identity. One such individual, Pyotr Vysotsky, who is pictured there, was one of these leaders of the uprising and writes about this endeavor later on in one of his uh, diaries. And excuse my Polish, I'm a bit rusty, but he writes: W miłości tylko ojczyzny, szczerej sobą, prawdziwej, może każdy odczuć, co na jego sumienia leży i kiedy ma spełnić. Aby się nie stał samozwańcem, jak to trafie wyrzekł Goszczynski, och tych, co nie powołani w nienależnym czasie narażają zuchwale i z siebie samych czeka przed Bogiem odpowiedzialność i naród swój nieznaczony mu cierpienie i klęski. Now, excuse my botched translation, but essentially what this is saying is that Vysotsky, who was a leader in the uprising and arguably started it, he's writing that every citizen who truly loves their country, and people who have this love of a country, can only then can citizens realize that they have to fight for their love of the country, not in the style of vigilante or revenge against an invader like Russia, but they need to consider their responsibilities given to them by God, to steer their nation from disaster and suffering that the nation of Poland is already under. And this perfectly encapsulates how a literate noble like Vysotsky would describe the situation that the nobility feel within Poland at the time. It's as if the uprising against Russia was akin to a holy crusade in their endeavor. This sentiment of nationalism, this great example of it, would quite literally define the Polish nationalist movement during the uprising, and this leading noble would set the standard for this ideology in and out of the nation for years to come. The fact that this individual was a Polish noble and a military man, he was able to cement how this ideology led him to lead his nation away from the suffering and infringement that he believed the Russian Empire was inflicting. Eventually, the uprising would be suppressed by the Russian army, but examples of Vysotsky's ideology would spread throughout Poland and be even mass-produced among the Polish nobility and artists who would flee Poland at the time. One prominent artist at the time, by the name of Adam Mickiewicz, would publish a work called Pan Tadeusz, and it describes a nobleman from Lithuania, but is written in the vernacular Polish. And he explains within this story about the love of the culture and the language and the governmental style of a Lithuanian nobleman within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and this kind of adherence and love for the national identity would be widespread throughout Western Europe, where these nobles would flee, and subsequently these ideologies would stick in Western Europe. Many people would rally support among Western nations in an attempt to continue the fight for Polish independence against the Russian Empire. And this was the nobles' endeavor in this fight. This was how they decided to enact their nationalism into a real effort. But going back to the thesis, or the main argument that I brought up earlier, is what are the different fronts in which Polish nationalism assisted in the uprising of 1830 and to 31. And with that, I'm going to explain the peasant uprising. All right, going back to the peasantry and the role in this uprising, it's an important role to the narrative that I'm attempting to convey of these different fronts. The economic system within Poland, the peasant class of Poland specifically, were serfs. They were typically agrarian in nature, with a few artisan economies within cities, but nonetheless were agrarian. Typically, these people were illiterate, poorer than the nobles that I talked about earlier, and religious, where they were a large amount of them were Catholic, but they were still Jewish peasantry as well as Uniate followers, which I will explain later, but nonetheless a religious population. Surprisingly, I would like to posit that the Polish peasantry contributed greatly to Polish nationalism during the uprising against the Russian Empire and Tsar Nicholas I. And I would even argue to the same extent as Polish nobility. I want to read this poem by Gustav Ehrenberg, which was written after the uprising, but still is a great piece of cultural history. And the poem goes: Gdy naród do boju wystąpił z orężem, panowie o czynszach radzili, gdy naród zawołał umrzem lub zwyciężem. Panowie stolicy bawili. Armaty pod stoczkiem zdobywała wiara, rękami czarnymi od pługa. Panowie stolicy kuszyli cygara, radzili o braciach z Boga. And the direct translation of this would be: when the nation with arms rushed to fight, lords debated about land rents. When the nation was crying, let's win or die, lords enjoyed Varshovian balls or dances. The people at Stoczek took Muscovite guns with hands darkened by work, while Varshovian lords puffed on cigars, discussing friends from the book. Now, this poem perfectly encapsulates what the Polish peasantry were capable of. They actually did a lot of the hard work. They would provide a significant intelligence operations to the military when they were conducting guerrilla tactics against the Russian Empire. And they were able to mobilize and assist in the uprising. According to Milevich, despite the peasantry being illiterate, they still subscribe to the same idea as the nobility, this idea being of narud, or the people. This idea is that their struggle and fight in the uprising was for the sake of their people, their community, and homeland, all of which are core concepts of the philosophy of nationalism. And it's interesting how this philosophy was able to transfer to illiterate peasants and were able to fight for it. I want to emphasize that despite that the uprising only lasting a year, it provided such a microcosmic instance for Polish nationalism against the rule of the Russian Empire to truly blossom into an effort that was seen in both economic levels of the nation, the nobility and the peasantry. And I cannot point a lot of fingers to any sort of historical instance in which the aristocracy and the lower classes of a nation would fight for similar incentives with such intensity, especially a non-physical incentive like a nationalistic ideology like narud. And because of that, I find it really interesting that both classes were able to contribute almost equally in their uprising. And going from the peasant class, I now want to discuss how the clergy and the religious institutions of Poland assisted or didn't assist within the uprisings. Poland historically has typically been a Roman Catholic nation with a small majority of individuals subscribing to the Uniate Church, Orthodox churches, as well as Jewish communities. The Uniate Church is a church with Eastern Orthodox traditions, but falls under the jurisdiction of the Pope and Roman Catholicism and the Vatican, but nonetheless still has a lot of Orthodox traditions. And this differs from the Russian Orthodox Church, which held such a immense influence within the Russian Empire at the time. But nonetheless, the Polish Catholic Church often was a stronghold for Polish identity to take root, as the language was able to persist against Russification efforts and conversions against Catholics and Uniates. And this information is taken from Brian Porter, who I'm citing on the visual aid currently. Despite this, the clergy of the Catholic Church did not officially support the uprisings. Interestingly enough, despite the peasantry and the nobility kind of still pushing that national identity onto them, it kind of creates a sort of anomaly historically on how this can happen. Um, the clergy would often recommend the Polish people adhere to the Russian Empire. Pope Gregory the XVI would stress to people to adhere to civil obedience and the correct rule of justified rulers, which he viewed the Tsar Nicholas I as one of these individuals. Despite this, I want to note that with limited clergy participation with the uprisings of Poland, these institutions were absolutely instrumental in how both the nobility and peasantry would utilize uh, these institutions and subscribing Polish language and culture, a part of the Polish national identity, to these institutions, despite them not um, really consenting to it. But in terms of the Uniate Church, however, which was typically in eastern Poland, uh, back then it was dubbed Ruthenia, which would have been modern day Belarus, as well as parts of Ukraine. Nonetheless, according to Theodore Weeks, the Uniate clergy did support the insurgents of Poland to a greater extent than Catholic clergy did. And as a result of their contribution to both the uprisings and preservation of the Polish identity, were subsequently subject to intensive Russification efforts in the form of conversions, and even resulted in the deaths of clergy. A lot of individuals were martyred. One of the pictures I'm showing currently is one of these instances. Finally, I want to conclude this podcast with an event that would roughly occur 30 years after the uprisings of 1831. Events within Russia, like the Crimean War, specifically their defeat under Tsar Alexander II, brought about open discussions of reform within the empire, Poland being one of these regions within the empire. And this is when Poland seized an opportunity. Again, calling back the importance of the nobility, they created two factions during this time, one being the called the White faction, who wanted the old liberties that they had under Napoleon, and an even more radical Red group, who consisted of younger nobles who wanted a more direct democracy and even secession from Russia. Nonetheless, these factions of nobility perfectly encapsulate how nationalism was able to spur a historical moment at this time against Russia, as demanding better control of their government away from foreign occupational forces like the Russian Empire just perfectly conveys nationalistic ideologies. Furthermore, the nobility and writers who fled Poland after 1831 would have already spread ideas such as the struggle of Poland and Narud, further intensifying Polish nationalism, as well as other nations like Italy being able to unify due to romanticized nationalism. The event that spurred this, according to Adam Zamoyski, was the Polish politician put in charge of Poland by Tsar Alexander II, and his name was Alexander Wielkopolski. He decided to quell the Red faction by conscripting young nobles into the Russian army, and on January 22nd, 1863, these cadets, these young nobles and military men would revolt. It is at this point that both factions would initially join together and declare a provisional government, and they would decide to create an uprising in an attempt to gain independence. However, according to Malt, the uprising would fall short due to the onslaught of Russian forces and limited appeal to the peasantry, which contrasts the uprising of 1831, meaning that this was strictly an uprising conducted by the nobility and some clergy. But despite this, I want to conclude this podcast on the importance of the Russian response and how it shows just how important the Polish identity and nationalist ideology played in creating this event. Russia would ramp up its Russification efforts following this uprising in 1863 tenfold following this. And universities would be closed within Russia. The Polish language would be suppressed within important institutions, as well as intense efforts by Tsar Alexander II to create forced conversions of the Uniate church members and clergy. And a lot of mass exiles of prisoners of war were conducted into Siberia. The sheer fact that Russia would take such drastic measures against the language, culture, and religious identity of Poland just displays the large contribution it had to the uprisings. And hopefully, through the message I was trying to convey through this podcast, is that ideology and nationalism taken from these individuals, these three different parts of the Polish society during these time were able to enact such great historical change and fight against one of the great empires of history, the Russian Empire. Um, and it's very, very important that these individuals were inspired by nationalism, as this ideology would allow the Polish identity to live on well into 1918. And I'm not saying this out of any sort of bias, but generally, without nationalism, I do not think the Polish nobility, peasantry, and clergy would fight back against the Russian Empire to such an extent, as these ideologies of nationalism were very key and important in forming the ideas of individuals like Vysotsky and Adam Mickiewicz, as well as the poem that I relate to you. These people utilized these ideas and turned it into action against the Russian Empire, a very powerful nation state at the time. And because of that, it creates such a unique historical instance that I feel is very, very worthy of study. So that is my podcast. I am going a minute over the limit, but I just want to thank you for listening and have a nice day.